As is the case with any NFL draft, there are plenty of Seahawks veterans who are thrilled about the newcomers in this year's draft class. And on the other side of the coin, there's plenty of players that are going to have to look behind their back a little closer with incoming competition. We're going to be looking at the winners and losers returning for the Seahawks after the 2024 NFL Draft on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in from Missoula, Montana, or Ruston, Louisiana. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We are going to be taking a look at which veterans benefited from the 2024 NFL draft class and which ones are going to be looking closer in the rearview mirror with a new class coming in, maybe to compete against them for a roster spot. Plus, we're going to break down some what-if scenarios, how different that the draft could have looked for the Seahawks with a few scenarios if they would have played out a little differently last week. Should have a lot of fun with that as well. It's a jam-packed episode brought your way by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. You can say this about any draft class. Once teams have reeled in their new group of players, there's going to be veterans returning that are fired up about key additions that are made to the roster, particularly your stars. We added incoming talent that can make this team better, both in the present and the future. But there's always the business reality, Rob, and that is that there's going to be some players that are not the stars. They're not the notable starters on the roster, but they still are under contract that maybe have some new competition coming in that's going to impact their standing, potentially knock them off the roster. That's just the reality how the NFL works. There's a reason it's called the Not For Long League. So keeping that in mind, we are going to be looking at the winners and losers. And again, I don't like throwing around that term, but this is a business, and there are going to be players that don't benefit or look like they're not going to benefit from this incoming draft class. That's just the way it goes for all 32 teams. We're going to start on offense, Robin. Let's start with the positives, the bright side. And I know there's one position in particular that you feel like an offense that the players on the roster should be thrilled with the way the draft went.
Well, I'll mention two players, Geno Smith and Sam Howell. I think that had any one of the top 6 quarterbacks been available to the Seahawks at number 16 overall, then there could be some ruffled feathers, so to speak, among the Seahawks quarterbacks. The way that there was in the Atlanta region when Kirk Cousins, of course, signed a $100 million deal only to see the Atlanta Falcons draft Michael Penix Jr., one of the shocking selections here. And to me, I mention this because that was one of the best examples of a veteran player who was a winner just a couple of weeks ago, but now maybe questioning if he is a little bit of a loser throughout this process. So like you, Corbin, I struggle to describe veterans as winners or losers throughout this process, but let's be real about how this actually works out. So again, to me, Sam Howell is one of the real winners of this class because the fact that Seattle did not take a quarterback in the 2024 draft, I think just kind of legitimizes the trade that the Seahawks made to acquire Sam Howell. And every report that I have had from the Seahawks scouts who've actually been able to watch Sam Howell throw the football in Seattle have been just effusive in their praise with the way that he has taken over in terms of his leadership and in terms of just his pure arm strength and accuracy.
Yeah, these guys are both big winners. No quarterbacks being picked. The only new quarterbacks being added to the roster. Javon Cordero is an undrafted free agent signing. And then they got a couple of guys that are going to be trying out this week at rookie minicamp. So there's not going to be any of that extra pressure. There's not going to be that incoming first-round pick that suddenly muddies up the picture for either Geno Smith or Sam Howell. So those guys are clearly winners. And Geno Smith, from a starter standpoint, You got to love it that the Seahawks used 3 out of their 8 picks on offensive linemen, including arguably the best pass protecting offensive lineman in the country in Christian Haynes. You look at the numbers and it backs it up. The guy's been a stone wall that moves really well, protecting at UConn. So Geno Smith's going to be fired up about those new weapons, as Jim Harbaugh likes to call them. Offensive linemen are weapons. So he's going to be excited about that. Speaking of offensive linemen, you and I are both in agreement. Oluwatimi's got to be a big winner here because no center is being drafted. None of the linemen picked here. Not that Christian Haynes couldn't learn to play center, but none of the players Seattle drafted in the O-line have any experience playing that position. Oluwatimi clearly is the front runner now to be that starter in year 2. But for me, my second big winner, this might be a surprise for our listeners, but I'm going Noah Fant. And here's my rationale behind it. The Seahawks did draft a tight end in A.J. Barner, but he's not a field stretcher. He's not a high-volume target tight end. He's going to be more of that Will Dissly type that's going to get a lot of his work done in the trenches, doing the dirty work. They didn't add any other receivers either. So Noah Fant's got to be sitting there thinking, I already felt better with this new offense, but no new weapons that are going to be taking away a bunch of targets from me. I get to play out in the slot more with Barner playing inline, Pharaoh Brown playing inline. So I actually think Noah Fant's got to be really excited about how this draft played out.
Oh, no question about it. I mean, I think that he was excited when he signed the free agent deal to return to Seattle. But I think that he is even more excited now, as you said, that even though the Seahawks drafted a tight end in the middle rounds, that is not a player who is likely to be pushing Noah Fant as far as the true seam stretcher that Ryan Grubb had, used to such effectiveness with the University of Washington. I think that Kenny McIntosh, the running back, of course, selected in the 7th round a year ago. Corbin, when considering the fact that McIntosh never got onto the field for the Seahawks last season, and now, of course, there is a brand new coaching staff here in place, I think that he had to be kind of biting his nails a little bit. Like, what might the Seahawks, considering the way that John Schneider has always drafted running backs, might this be a position that Seattle would look to upgrade? And there's perhaps, a possibility, considering the fact that they brought in a couple of players as free agents, but not a single one of their 8 selections was used on a running back. I think that Kenny McIntosh, obviously Zach Charbonnet and Ken Walker III as well, but definitely Kenny McIntosh to me was one of those players that was a little bit more on the roster bubble. And so I think he's got to be breathing a big sigh of relief that Seattle, again, did not invest a selection in the running back position.
Speaking of sighs of relief, I think fans should have that because my last big winner, Abraham Lucas, because Seattle had a chance to draft Troy Fautanu with pick number 16, who was a tackle at Washington's, probably going to play guard in the NFL, though Pittsburgh might keep him at tackle. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. But if the Seahawks really had reservations about Abraham Lucas's health moving forward, I think that they would have strongly considered drafting a tackle type early, especially with the opportunity to pick Troy Fautanu. There were a few other players that were available there. Amarius Mims from Georgia was still on the board. They could have gone with a tackle if they viewed that as an urgent need there. But this tells me the Seahawks have some optimism about Abraham Lucas. So to me, that is a big deal. Now on the flip side, again, I don't like using the connotation loser, but look, in stock watch, there's winners and there's losers. And in the NFL, there are winners and losers. That's the way it goes. And I can't help but look at a player that signed a 1-year contract with the Seahawks. And again, it was a near veteran minimum. This is not a big name, but Tremaine Ancrum's now got to be sitting thinking, where am I going to have any chance to compete for playing time here? Seattle bringing in 2 very experienced rookies, Christian Haynes, Satoa Lamea. I can never say his name right. But both those guys playing the guard positions are very experienced. You've got Anthony Bradford coming back in year 2. The Seahawks are still very high on him. Laken Tomlinson's there. You got to wonder where Tremaine Ancrum's going to have any chance to fit into this equation now after signing with the Seahawks. And when he did sign with them, it was a wide open depth chart. That is now no longer the case.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you mentioned Satoa Lamea, just because the fact that he actually, while Mike McDonald listed him as a guard or described him as a guard during the post-game or post-draft press conference. But actually on the Seattle's roster is listed as a tackle. And so that's why I'm going to mention Stone Forsythe here. Now, Stone Forsythe, I thought, did an admirable job this past season when he was pushed into the starting rotation with Abraham Lucas struggling with durability. But the fact that Seattle brought in, a tackle that we're both very excited about, Michael Jarrell, they bring in George Fant as a free agent, who of course has that swing ability. And again, with Laumea, I don't know that he has the physicality that I personally am looking for at the guard position. There's some questions about whether he can handle that tackle spot. He did struggle with speed rushers off of the edge, but for the same exact reasons that you were mentioning why Tremaine Ankrum may be somebody who is a little bit worried about who the Seahawks brought in on draft day, I think that Stone Forsythe has to be somebody who also is a little bit concerned because, again, Michael Jarrell and then Satoa Laumea, to me, are players that might be able to handle, especially Laumea from Utah, who played an awful lot of right tackle as well as an awful lot of right guard. He is cheaper, he's younger, and frankly, I think that he is every bit as talented as Stone Forsythe is. So I think that it just sets up for a fascinating training camp where there's going to be an awful lot of football players, especially along the line of scrimmage for the Seahawks on offense, that are basically going to have to compete. Otherwise, they may lose their job.
Yeah, those are going to be some really fun competitions, the starting jobs, the guard spots, and then the backup positions at tackle, because Seattle now does have some really intriguing young players they've thrown into the mix, and there's a lot more depth than there was a few weeks ago. We come back, we're going to do the same thing on the defensive side of the ball. Who are the winners coming out of this draft class, and which players aren't necessarily feeling good about things with this new group of players coming to the Seahawks? We'll be breaking it all down up next here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy, and it also keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether it's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. If you're into speed, power, or style, whatever your choice, eBay Motors has got you covered. They've got over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, ensuring you'll always get exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time and your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is also brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, and comedy near you, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Game Time makes sure you won't be pulling your hair out the next time that you buy tickets. Recently, I purchased a playoff ticket to watch the Avalanche against the Jets. And Colorado, thank goodness they didn't lose 7-0 like the previous time. They won 5-1, and now they are advancing to the second round of the NHL playoffs. My wife and I went for under $400 for both tickets thanks to Game Time. We had an absolute blast. It didn't cost an arm and a leg either, and we had a great experience. Game Time has deals on tickets right at the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section in a row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, creating an account, and using the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are continuing our annual post-draft stock watch, winners and losers. Which veterans benefited the most from this new draft class, and which returning players might be looking over their shoulder with a little bit of sweat pouring down from their brow? It is time to look at that on the defensive side of the football, the winners and the losers. Let's talk about the players that are excited about this incoming draft class, or the ones that are going to breathe a sigh of relief. And Rob, I'm going to give you the mic first. And I know there's one player in particular that's been under fire, and for some good reason. The play has not been quite up to snuff for expectations as a former second-round pick, and yet the Seahawks didn't bring in any extra competition, giving him one last real opportunity to get things turned around.
A real opportunity, and that is the thing, Corbin. Darrell Taylor, I think, is one of the real big winners of Seattle making the selection of Byron Murphy II. There was a question that was posed to us yesterday, and frankly, Corbin, I fumbled it. They asked who was one of the big winners of the Seahawks making the selection of Byron Murphy, and I jumped immediately to offense and to the fan base, because I think that number 91 is the number that the Seahawks have announced that Byron Murphy is going to be playing with. I think that he is going to make an awful lot of big plays that is going to get Geno Smith and the fan base very excited. I also think that it is going to provide a clearer avenue for a pass rusher that, in my opinion, remains the most explosive of the Seahawks edge rushers, and that being Darrell Taylor. And I'll mention one other thing about this is, as I drove home from the Seahawks draft just a couple of days ago, I happened to swing by and look at the outside of the stadium, and I was stunned to see that the Seahawks have changed the mural, and Leonard Williams now has his picture out there. And I thought there might be one of, say, Uchenna Nwosu, a Boye Mafe. It was Darrell Taylor whose image was on the outside of the stadium. So again, I think the Seahawks are anticipating that Darrell Taylor is going to have a splashy 2024 season and be a big winner from this draft class as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to go the same position. I think from Derek Hall's standpoint, not only do you not have any new competition that you're going to have to worry about coming in, and there's going to be some undrafted rookies, and maybe somebody like Caesar from Houston's going to come in and make a little bit of a run for a roster spot, but Seahawks didn't draft anybody. Derek Hall's going to have a chance to be able to continue his development, and maybe he can have a Boye Mafe type jump in year two, especially with a change in scheme. The other reason he's a winner, two of his former teammates from Auburn are now current teammates in Seattle in the secondary. This is turning into the Seattle Tigers. Before we know it, the entire defense is going to be Auburn players. So Derek Hall's got to be excited about that. So moving away from the serious reasons, but no guys drafted his position, and he also gets a couple of his former teammates that he's really close to as well that are all hyper-competitive players, certainly going to benefit. As far as my next big winner, going to go to the safety position, and I had a couple guys that I was considering here since Seattle didn't draft any safeties, but I think Kayvon Wallace, this is the opposite of Tremaine Ankrum that I just talked about. Ankrum's now got all these incoming rookies, and there's Laken Tomlinson, all these new players that have been added that weren't here when he signed. Kayvon Wallace doesn't have any new safeties that he has to worry about. Right now, he looks like he is a shoo-in to be that third safety. When Jarek Reed II gets back healthy, maybe that changes a little bit, but I think he's got to be feeling pretty good about his standing in the secondary with Rayshawn Jenkins and Julian Love.
I think he does, but I think that there's also a quote-unquote angry little elf in Jarek Reed who might also be feeling pretty good about the fact that the Seahawks did not draft a safety, among their 8 selections here. And I got some positive feedback from some of the folks there in the VMAC that the Jarek Reed's recovery from surgery is going well. We know in the past that players who stood out on special teams were going to get their opportunities on defense or on offense, but especially on defense in the past. Now, of course, that was the past. We have a whole new coaching staff here. It remains to be seen, but still, I think that there's no doubt about it. The Kayvon Wallace and Jarek Reed II, I think, are two safeties who definitely were viewed as possibly guys that might be, concerned about what the Seahawks might do. And instead, now I think they're feeling a huge sigh of relief at this point. I'm going to switch over to the linebacker position. Corbin, I know that Tyrel Dodson is a player that I have been high on and kind of have, argued that I thought that was one of the Seattle's kind of sneaky signings in the free agency period here. And there's no doubt about it that Tyrese Knight, I personally believe, ultimately is going to wind up pushing Tyrel Dodson for that Mike spot. But Mike McDonald, obviously Seattle's head coach, actually characterized Tyrese Knight as a better fit, at least initially, at the weak side linebacker spot. And so I think that was fascinating as well. So to me, I think that Tyrel Dodson, who I thought once the Seahawks signed him from Buffalo, Buffalo. I thought that he was going to be your kind of plug and play starter. I do think that he has got to be feeling a little bit better about the fact that Seattle did not kind of mortgage their future to trade up earlier to acquire a linebacker, because there wasn't the linebacker really worthy of number 16 overall. But the fact that they didn't draft one until the 4th round, and Tyrese Knight, a player that again is a kind of a ball of clay, that you see the upside with him, but he doesn't feel like a player who is going to push for starting time immediately. I think the Tyrell Dotson as well as Jerome Baker are feeling a lot better about their positions on the Seahawks defense as well.
This last one for me, I'm going to have some listeners being like, you've got some explaining to do, because during the draft, right after Byron Murphy II got drafted, not traded, but I was thinking about, you've got a little bit of a logjam here at defensive tackle. Might this mean that, and I didn't say this specifically, but could this mean that Draymond Jones is potentially on the market? But the more that I've sat back and thought about this, without drafting an edge defender, I'm wondering if Mike McDonald and his staff are looking at what happened second half last year and saying, look, we think that Draymond Jones actually is going to have more of an impact if he is that interchangeable guy that's going to play some as a big end and play as a stand-up defender, which he had success doing with the Denver Broncos earlier in his career. So I look at Byron Murphy II coming in as a 3-tech, going with Leonard Williams, and the penetration those guys can create, the pass rush they can create. If Draymond Jones is in there with both those guys, he can benefit as much as anyone playing off the edge with his power. So I actually think Draymond Jones, I'm going to put him down as a winner here. I think this helps him a lot, bringing in Byron Murphy II. And real quick, as we mentioned on offense, there's got to be the flip side. There's the players who didn't necessarily benefit from this position group or this draft class that was being brought in. And it's interesting because if Kobe Bryant is going to be a safety, Seattle, as we've mentioned in this segment here, they didn't draft a safety, and yet he's in a different position than the other two safeties that we mentioned, Rob. So I hate to continue piling it on here because we talked about this some yesterday, but I'm just trying to figure out where Kobe Bryant fits in this puzzle at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a player definitely that has to be a little bit concerned. I would mention another veteran defensive back in Artie Burns. You draft the two Auburn cornerbacks, Nehemiah Pritchett, DJ James, both of them who have elite speed. I think that the veterans, Michael Jackson, as well as Artie Burns, have got to basically put on notice at this point. I thought that Michael Jackson, as a starter, had proven himself a little bit more than Artie Burns had. And in my opinion, Artie Burns made this roster a year ago in that final preseason game. And so I think that he is right on the edge. And of course, we've got to mention Levi Bell. That was some of the big news today, is that Levi Bell was released by the Seahawks. So clearly he is one of the, again, unfortunate to use this term, losers throughout this draft process. But again, that is the reality of the NFL draft, as the Seahawks brought in two cornerbacks, both of whom have the speed to and special teams ability to perhaps replace a player who feels like he's kind of on the edge of this roster already. So that's why I'm listing Artie Burns at this point.
Yeah, and that really is the big reason that Kobe Bryant's in the position he's in, because he played slot corner and played it pretty well his rookie year. And then last year, the toe injury, and John Schneider and Mike McDonald have been talking about trying to figure out where he fits in. I don't think anybody really knows at this point. And now that you just drafted two corners who are far more athletic than what Kobe Bryant is, and probably are better suited to play inside if you're going to do that from an athleticism standpoint, again, I'm just not sure where he fits in. I'm hoping that he comes out and gives a fight, and I expect he will. I just don't know where they're going to be playing him at and where there's going to be snaps for him to have at this point. But we'll see. Maybe he ends up surprising, but right now, this does not look like a good situation for him with the depth and all this new talent that's been added to an already deep secondary. It's going to be really tough sledding for both those players that we just mentioned. Up next, the draft is now in the rearview mirror, but that doesn't mean we can't look back and think about what may have happened if a few dominoes would have fallen differently. We're going to play a little bit of what if with the Seahawks draft, how things might have unfolded differently if scenarios played out a bit different last week. We'll get to those here in a moment on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode's brought your way by Monopoly Go. I've been tracking the leaderboards every day, keeping my eye on the scores, putting all my heart into it, and I'm super pumped to announce I'm still on top. Nobody has caught up with me yet. That's right. Obviously, I'm talking about the hit mobile game Monopoly Go. You've probably heard of it. It's been downloaded over 150 million times. I've got it on my phone. I've got it on my wife's phone. It's a great mobile twist on classic Monopoly. You can play anywhere, anytime. Explore hundreds of Monopoly boards from Las Vegas to Camelot to the moon, all while raking in a huge fortune. And of course, you can charge rent on iconic properties just like you do in classic Monopoly. The best part now, you can go after your opponent's Monopoly money by pulling bank heists and taking wrecking balls to their landmarks. That's maybe my favorite part. The leaderboards are also exciting. You can see who's a Monopoly tycoon and who's gone bankrupt. So get yourself on the charts. Download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store and on Google Play. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Moving towards the NFL draft in review. Now that it's in the rearview mirror, we've talked about all the players that Seattle has drafted. We've talked about the undrafted rookies that have reportedly been signed on offense, defense, the special teams players. It's time to look back in reflection because, Rob, you and I both know how unpredictable the NFL draft is, and just one small wrinkle going a different way can completely change how the draft board unfolds for all 32 teams. The Seahawks are no different. So we are going to play a little bit of what-if action here, some what-if scenarios for the Seattle Seahawks. And I'm going to give you the floor first because I know that there's been some things you've been pondering about, and this is the draft expert in you, just wondering, man, if this would have happened, what would have been the next domino that fell if this would have played differently? What's the first scenario that is going through your head that you're wondering about? What if from a Seahawks perspective?
Well, what if from a Seahawks perspective? What if from a Mount Tahoma Thunderbirds perspective? That's the reason why I'm wearing this shirt today, Corbin, is I wonder if Taliesin Fuaga, who, of course, won a couple of selections earlier to the New Orleans Saints, if all of those quarterbacks had not gone, if a couple of defensive players had gone earlier, if Tali would have fallen into the lap of the Seahawks at number 16 overall. And so I was kind of kicking the tires on that exact scenario with some of the sources was inside the VMAC, and I was essentially assured that Taliesin Fuaga had been there. If Byron Murphy had not been there, Seattle would have stuck and picked Taliesin Fuaga to be the number 16 overall selection. And so that to me is fascinating because not only would that have, erased the need to take a Christian Haynes, number 81 overall, I think that it also would have raised all kinds of scenarios because you look at the defensive tackle class that would have been available to Seattle in the third round, and Corbin, it was not very good. There were 7 defensive tackles that went in the second round. So Seattle would have had to have been very, very aggressive if they wanted to follow the same formula that they did in terms of addressing the line of scrimmage on both sides. So again, to me, that is the what if scenario, the road not taken scenario that the Seahawks would have had to consider had the board not fallen the way that it did.
You're looking at the high school alumni. I'm looking at the college alumni nearby. Similar position here. And to me, this is truly the biggest what-if question based on how things played out in this particular scenario. And that has to be, for me, Troy Fautanu, who was available at 16. What if the Seahawks decided to take him instead of Byron Murphy II? And it really leads into the second question that you just pitched. We saw all that talent that went off the board in the second round at defensive tackle. It's pretty slim pickings once you get to pick 81. The Seahawks are not going to have the fortune that they had with Christian Haynes falling into their lap as a starter-ready guard in the third round. You're not going to have that kind of luck getting a defensive tackle with the way this draft unfolded. And we talked about it. It was a pretty good at the top class at that position, but there was a big drop-off at defensive tackle. And that's about where that drop-off happened, was early to mid-third round. So that really would have changed the entire structure of the draft. We might have seen John Schneider trade around a little bit more just because of necessity. And that leads me into my second big what if. These all start to go together like spider webs. But for me, if you ended up in a position like that, the big what if for me, what if Seattle trades up into the late second round? And I thought that for sure they were going to do that with the way that that draft was playing out. Junior Colson, for example, the linebacker out of Michigan who played for Mike McDonald a couple years ago, he was still available going into the third round. And John Schneider mentioned in his post-draft press conference on day 3 that, or on day 2, that they were trying to trade up. And when I asked if it was for Christian Haynes, if you read between the tea leaves, it sounded to me like he was hinting at, well, there was another guy, but I'm not going to tell you who that was. You've got to wonder if Junior Colson is the player they were considering there. And if they would have picked a player in the first round, like, say, Fotanu, or if they would have gone with Fuaga, with an offensive lineman, we might be talking about trading up to get that defensive tackle to reinforce your defensive line too. So that is another huge what if for me, because I thought there were some really prime opportunities where they could have moved up to get a player. It ended up working out fine, getting Christian Haynes with the way that it actually played out. But you lost a lot of really good linebackers and defensive tackles in the late second, early third before the Seahawks were on the board. If they were in a need of those positions there and they'd addressed the offensive line already, John Schneider might have been in a far more difficult position once the Seahawks were on the board at 81.
He would have been in a really difficult position. Michael Penix Jr. would have fallen into their lap, because I do think that there was an awful lot of folks in that building who were pushing for Penix to be the selection. And so to me, that is one of the what ifs that we have to consider here. Had he fallen, and I think that the Seahawks read the board beautifully. I think that was one of the reasons why they made the trade for Sam Howell, was because they anticipated that all 6 of those quarterbacks were going to be off the board. That's one of the reasons why they brought in Bo Nix for that top 30 visit. But again, I think that would have been a fascinating possibility for them. We know the fit, of course, that Michael Penix has in Ryan Grubb's offense. And oh my goodness, can you just imagine Michael Penix slinging those left-handed balls to a DK Metcalf deep down the field, or all the other Seahawk wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs in that offense. I think as you just kind of pointed out a moment ago, Corbin, it actually did work out really, really well for the Seahawks in terms of going with a defensive player early, because there was such a run once the top 16 selections went off the board. Or I guess I should say top 14 selections, because Indianapolis took Leatu Latu at 15 overall, and that's really where things started to go more to the defensive side. But still, had Seattle had Michael Penix on the board, I do believe that they may have absolutely taken him at that spot, and that, of course, would have changed things up. We'd be talking about the same kind of things in Seattle that the Atlanta Falcons are questioning right now with themselves, with Kirk Cousins being there, Desmond Ridder being there, second-round pick just a couple of years ago, and of course now Michael Penix, the number 8 overall selection, all doing an awful lot of money and all chomping at the bit to get onto the field.
Yeah, I'm more curious about what if Seattle would have actually tried to trade in the top 10. Now, that report that came out, I can tell you I have talked to a bunch of informed sources that have indicated that was not at all the case. And I really don't know what the Seahawks could have offered unless they were going to be giving up future first rounders in bulk. I don't know what they could have done to move into the top 10 to get a Michael Penix Jr., who obviously was viewed much higher than what a lot of these draft pundits were trying to say, with the Falcons picking him at number 8. There were other teams that clearly wanted him, but the Seahawks did not have the assets to do that. But I want to kind of piggyback off that idea, because if the Seahawks would have had a trade in place to go up and get Michael Penix, they would have had a lot less picks. You can guarantee they would have had to give up several of their other picks in this draft class, along with their future first rounders, and they would have inevitably had to trade down multiple times to try to recoup picks on day 3. They did that anyway in the 4th round, and this is maybe the one decision that John Schneider made in this draft that I'm still kind of scratching my head about a little bit, because I felt like moving down from 102 to 121, dropping almost 20 spots at that stage, that was really where the draft was teetering on the precipice of the stock, the player of value just dropping off a cliff, was right there. And it felt like there were guys like Cedric Gray that were still out there on the board at linebacker that I think is a little more polished than Tyrese Knight is at this point. There were some other really good players that were still on the board at the safety position, and they chose to trade back, and then a bunch of those guys flew off the board, and suddenly now you are in that downhill slide that we expected here once you got past about the top 100 picks. So to me, that is a big what if. What if you would have just stuck there and instead of getting an extra pick, just pick the best player you can get your hands on there, and how differently that might play out the rest of the picks that they had in this draft as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Cedric Gray, the linebacker from North Carolina, who I think may have been in play for the Seahawks. 2 players from Oregon as well. Kyrie Jackson, the corner, Brandon Dorless, the defensive lineman. Of course, once the Seahawks made the selection of Byron Murphy, I think the Dorless probably was not going to be in play. But I do believe that the former Alabama turned Oregon corner, Kyrie Jackson, would have been in play for them. I'm going to throw out one final kind of scenario. I think that had Leatu Latu, who went number 15, had he been available, obviously Dallas Turner, viewed by many as a top edge rusher. Clearly the Seahawks selected Byron Murphy ahead of him. Chop Robinson being another one. Jared Verse was linked to the Seahawks. I think if all of those players had been available to them, and Byron Murphy is off the board, Taliesin Fuaga is off the board, Troy Fautanu is on the board as he was, I still think the Seattle trades down. I think that was the scenario that I envisioned would happen. And frankly, I still am surprised that Seattle did not trade down. But once Byron Murphy fell into your lap, then it basically made every other conversation moot. The Seahawks recognized him as the best defensive player on the draft. And again, the depth at guard, corner, linebacker, tight end was good enough for Seattle to take full advantage of it, make the selection of Byron Murphy the second, and completely transform, Seattle's defense into one that should be able to create a lot more pressure on quarterbacks moving forward.
And be better against the run, quite frankly.
Exactly.
We know that Byron Murphy II is stout against the run. And as we've outlined here with all these different scenarios that didn't happen, really, the first 2 days, this is not being a homer because I cover the team. I don't know that the first 2 days of the draft with only 2 picks, no second rounder, I just don't know that it could have gone better for the Seahawks. You got the defensive player that you coveted. He fell into your lap. And then Christian Haynes, a player that I've been told the Seahawks had a second-round grade on, which I would fully believe based on the attention they paid to him in the offseason and just the needs they had, the kind of player he is. Get him in 81 again. You can question some of the things that happen on day 3, but day 3 picks are always a bigger crapshoot anyway, especially in a draft like this where really the talent just fell off after the first 100 or so players. So I think in all, we can just first 2 days. We'll see what happens on the field with these 2 picks, but Seattle really had perfect scenarios there where they were at, having plug-and-play guys fall to them both in the first round and in the third round. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, going to have some takeaways from John Schneider, Mike McDonald, and Byron Murphy II's co-press conference that they're going to be hosting tomorrow at the VMAC, and a preview for rookie minicamp as well. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday night, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.